Welcome. We'll be with you in just a few minutes. We're still waiting for some other folks to log on, so just bear with us for a few minutes. Research. If you're new to the organization, we are an intercultural organization. We also offer these monthly webinar series amongst many other things. So we are happy to provide more information if you're interested in learning more about us. My name is Julia Gaspar-Bates. I serve on the SIETAR USA Board of Directors as the Local Groups Director. And I'm delighted to have our webinar host here today, Joe Lurie, who will be talking about understanding misunderstanding. Before we get started and before I introduce Joe, just a few housekeeping rules. If I could ask everybody to please mute your phones just to avoid any background noise, we would greatly appreciate that. There will be also ample time for Q&A, for more formal Q&A at the end. So if you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to write them in the chat box. I will be monitoring those, and at the end we will have the opportunity to either unmute your phones to have a live chat with Joe, or I will be monitoring any questions that you write in during the course of the webinar. There will also be a couple of opportunities where Joe will be asking you for some information and for your perceptions on things. So please do type those into the chat box during the workshop, during the webinar as well. And I will once again be monitoring those. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Joe Lurie as our key speaker this morning. Joe is the Executive Director Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley's International House, and has a very illustrious career. Starting in the Peace Corps, he's lived all over the world. He's been an active teacher, intercultural trainer, and consultant on cross-cultural communications. And he's also the author of an award-winning book called Perception and Deception, a mind-opening journey across cultures, which was recently updated in 2018. I'm going to let Joe talk a little bit more about his work in the intercultural field and his involvement with SIETAR, but would like to give a warm welcome to Joe.
Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you very much, Julia. Just briefly, I might just give a sense of what brought me to the field and what ultimately culminated in this book, Perception and Deception, a mind-opening journey across cultures. It all started in the Peace Corps back in the late 60s, where I was assigned to Kenya. And en route to Kenya, I remember getting out at the airport in Entebbe, Uganda, 2 o'clock in the morning, heavy, humid air. It was all of this excitement, the fans slowly whirling, and I remember saying to a fellow volunteer, "Wow, we're in Africa. Don't you smell the lions?" Well, what I came to understand not long after was that there were no lions within 20 miles of that airport. And then I began to ask myself, why did I think I was smelling lions? And it was all about the narrative that I was locked into, because then, and too often today, images of Africa are related to safaris, animals, poverty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I was locked into this one image of lions, which actually affected my senses. So when I came back to the United States 3 years later, my goal was to try to get as many Americans overseas as possible, which led to a career in the world of international educational exchange. One of the most profound periods was working for AFS International, where I think one of the powers of that experience was to see young people, particularly in high school, living with families who didn't speak their language, total immersion. And that was such a mind opener that it then propelled me to want to work in the field of international educational exchange on a broader level. And ultimately, I came to work for 20 years at International House at UC Berkeley, where, for those of your viewers who are not aware, close to 600 students from 75 to 80 countries, including 25 US states, live together, do activities together, and in the process come to understand realities they had never dreamed of, or frequently abandoned biases that they didn't even know they had. So let me just give you one example, which is kind of a transition to the talk I'll be giving today. I remember a Filipino woman who was working in our program office. She was a resident, a Christian, and there was a Pakistani gentleman, also a resident, Muslim, working in the program office. And the purpose of International House is to foster understanding, intercultural understanding, et cetera, et cetera. And she would not speak to him. Why did this Filipino woman not want to speak to this Pakistani gentleman? Because, as many of you know, in the southern part of the Philippines, there has been Islamic terrorism. So because he's a Muslim, she doesn't talk to him, not even a moment, until she gets sick. And when you get sick at International House, people from the dining room will come and bring the food to your room so you don't infect other people. Who was the first person to bring her food? The Pakistani gentleman. So this brought to mind that sometimes to get over some of our biases, our difficult moments with larger narratives, you have to touch the heart to open the mind. And so ultimately, when I retired from International House, I decided to put this all together in a book called Perception and Deception, and it was published by Cultural Detective. Many of you know Diane Hoffner-Saphir, and I was much influenced by her approach, her cultural detective approach, and actually I use it in the book at the end of each chapter to help people debrief some of the things that are stunning to them at first. So what we're going to try to do today is I'm going to show you some images. And I'm going to ask all of you to think about what you think you're seeing. And in comparing the fact that some of us see things differently, I'm reminded of a quote, I don't remember exactly who said it, and that was that discovery consists of looking at the same thing as everyone else and seeing something different. So hopefully all of us, including me, of course, will have an opportunity to see things that we hadn't even dreamed we were looking at. So for example, let's take a look at this first slide. Can you all see that first slide? And then I think part of it is blocked off, but what I'm going to ask you to do is for you to tell me in the chat box, tell all of us in the chat box what you think. Oh, someone can't see the slide. I want to make sure everybody can see the slide, or what looks like the slide.
I have one person who's saying that they can't. Mirka, I don't know if you're able to see it now, but you might go in and just check your settings and make sure, because it looks like now I've seen some people saying it's half blocked.
Okay, somebody said I see ice cream is good. Does anyone see think they see something else? Somebody says okay, people say they can't see it.
Yeah, I'm seeing a number of people who say that they can't see.
Oh, well, here it is. And I now understand what's happening. I think people say, oh, I only see half of it. Okay, so let me go to the second slide. Let me show you what it says, because many people thought that it said ice cream is good. And the reality is it has nothing to do with that. Some people say Joe is something because I happen to be talking to you, and that's the anchor for the perception, right? See, somebody said, I thought it said Joe Agdabababa. Now I can see it. So the point of this, of course, is that we don't see the whole picture frequently, interpersonally, interculturally. So let me illustrate this again, how this came to be, because many people, when they see that first slide and then I show them the second slide, which you're looking at now, they can't believe it. So let's look at the third slide. Next slide. There you go. So you see the top looks like, for some people, ice cream is good, but if you don't see the bottom, you realize that the full picture is something entirely different. So let me illustrate this with something that I discovered in Kenya, but is true everywhere around the world today, and that is that the notion of touch can have different meanings across cultures in sometimes very dramatic, sometimes difficult ways, but hopefully in ways that can lead to discovery. So in Kenya, for example, and full disclosure, I am of heterosexual background, and when I went to Kenya, what struck me was that men were holding hands, and that the first time a gentleman in a conversation with me, a Kenyan gentleman in conversation with me, was holding my hand for the duration of the conversation, 20 minutes, which, given my narrow prison, made me very uncomfortable. So long and short of it, what did I learn from this? I learned that touch is culturally defined, that men throughout Africa, it's very common that men hold hands, has nothing to do with homosexuality in the vast majority of cases. That men in some Middle Eastern countries hold hands, has nothing to do with homosexuality. Men in parts of Asia hold hands. In fact, I saw recently the leaders of India and Pakistan at a front page picture on the New York Times holding hands together, which was of course misunderstood by a lot of people. And this was brought home to me when I told this story to a Nigerian friend of mine who came to San Francisco a few years ago and wanted to explore the gay neighborhood in San Francisco, which many of you know is called the Castro. But without thinking, he and his Nigerian friend went to the Castro holding hands, which had the meaning of, gee, this is just natural for us to be holding hands. It has no sexual connotation at all. And they could not understand why so many people were approaching them, inviting them into bars, asking them to participate in various parties. So it was a moment of laughter, but it was also that kind of laughter that is an opportunity for people to see something that they had never dreamed of seeing. So let's move on to the next slide, which is probably familiar to many of you. And I will just say briefly that in the majority of groups that I work with who've had little intercultural training, the vast majority, I would say 75 to 80%, when I ask them what it says, they say Paris in the spring. And the vast majority, and I suspect some of you in the audience, although many of you may have seen this before, do not see the double the. So it really says Paris in the spring. So why is it that the vast majority of people that I show it to, particularly people who have not been exposed to intercultural training and this kind of sensitivity of looking twice, thinking what else could this mean, why is it that they don't see the second the? It's because it's not been part of their narrative. And so let me just kind of try to illustrate this with a story that when I came back from the Peace Corps, and this has become a metaphor for much of the trainings I do and the talks I give. I was walking in Central Park in New York City with a colleague of mine, and she had her 3-year-old daughter with her. It was the first time that her 3-year-old daughter, the very first time, had been to Central Park, and she looked up in the sky, the mother told me, and said, "Mommy, look, and saw a bird flying freely in the air, and she said to her mother, "Mommy, where is that bird's cage?" Why did that young girl say, "Where is that bird's cage?" Because the only reality that she had to anchor her perception was in her apartment, where there was a parakeet in a cage. She had never been exposed to a bird flying freely. And this is what I often say, remind myself that I am in a prison, no matter, my prism is my prison often, as it is for everybody. No matter how well-traveled, how well-read, how experienced even an interculturalist, all of us have these extraordinary blinders of the limitations of our experience. So in a sense, we're all in a cage. And I'm going to try to use the sense of the cage to make the point that in an era of globalization, when YouTubes, tweets, fake news, refugees, immigrants are crossing cultures in unprecedented ways and in such a rapid fashion that people don't have the time, have much less time to evaluate who they're having contact with and how they are reacting to these contacts. So let's now move to the next slide. Next slide. There you go. So let me explain what this is, and then I'm going to invite you all to react, and we'll see what kinds of things you see. What is this? This is the original emblem of the first major international house in the United States in New York City, near Columbia University. And this was the emblem and the motto, International House, that brotherhood may prevail. And we had a major, many years ago during Black History Month, we had a major discussion about this. I'm going to ask all of you just quickly to put in your chat box, is there anything offensive that any of you see in this emblem? This, what do you call it? The motto, and as well as a kind of an image that represents the purposes of the house. Let's see, it looks like colonialism, okay. One person says colonialism. Let's see if anyone else has an objection to this image or the words, or the words. Trade, okay. Brotherhood, we're all women not represented. Africa is missing, right, exactly. So it was not an accident, and I'm sure many of you, as you're thinking about this and seeing what people are saying, many of you are saying, oh my goodness, look at what other people are saying. What brotherhood, slave ship, misrepresentation of size of countries, right. In this particular event that we had at International House, where there must have been 400 students from many countries celebrating Black History Month in the United States, the first and most visceral reaction was, how could an institution that is meant to foster brotherhood and understanding across cultures have a slave ship on its motto? So many people saw a slave ship, and this was, remember, back in 1924. Were boats like this then? Yes. Could one understand that people who have this very tragic and painful history would see that boat only as a representation of slavery? Yes. Were all boats like this involved with the slave trade? No. But it was also revealing that people said, well, I don't even see the continent of Africa. And then as one of you pointed out, someone said, what about women, that brotherhood may prevail? So long story short, we had a long discussion about this, and it is no longer the emblem at the International House in Berkeley, although we do show it to make the point for people of how they are limited by their perceptions. I just wanted to see, Julia, did anyone have a comment on this? How something as powerful as this can lead to great pain and misunderstandings.
Yeah, just I think the words that you read from the chat. So I don't see any other comments, but please, if people do have comments, feel free to put that into the chat. And particularly if anybody felt particularly offended by this, that might be helpful to hear as well, different perspectives on that.
Okay, so the next slide is actually related in a broad sense. So we can move to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to ask those of you, a few of you, just what do you think you're seeing? What do you see? See what some people are saying. When they look at this image, what do you think you're seeing? The KKK, okay? Too much like the KKK. Klansmen, okay? Keep going. KKK. Okay, Semana Santa. Now, there we go. What was that? I was in Spain. The previous comment was I was in Spain, and what was the comment, Julia? Did you see that last comment? I was in Spain.
Yes. So the person said, I was in Spain when I saw this advertised, and as an American, I was shocked.
Okay, and that is understandable. If your history, if your experience has only shaped these images as Ku Klux Klan, it would prevent you from understanding that in southern Spain during Easter, people dress like this in a gesture of penance. They are doing penance. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Ku Klux Klan. Now, I did research on this. I tried to find, was there some kind of link between the Ku Klux Klan and this particular ritual in southern Spain? I think it's also in southern Italy, if I'm not mistaken, during Easter. Yeah, there you go. Yes, if just American, I think that anywhere hooded people are dysfunctional. Well, that's we could do a whole webinar on that. But the point I'm trying to make here is, if you go to Spain and you see this at Easter and you have a particular reaction, you could run away, you could get angry, you could throw things, and you might be doing something that is totally inappropriate and does not connect with the actual reality here. So that's the reason that I show this particular image. Let's just move on to the next image. And there again is the same thing. This is all taking place. This is a ritual of penance in Spain. So let me give a practical example of how these things can really go awry. Not 2 years ago, many of you may remember, there was an ISIS bombing in Barcelona, Spain. My internet connection is unstable. It says, am I okay, everybody? Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Okay, it sounds fine, Joe, on my end. Anyway.
Okay, let me know, because if for some reason I tune out, I may have to go and restart my computer. But in any case, it sounds okay? Yeah, okay. So, Julia, everybody is okay? Yes, okay. So basically, here's the story. 2 years ago, you may remember there was an ISIS bombing in Barcelona. 2 weeks later, a student from Barcelona came to the UC Berkeley and moved into International House and was in his room with his US-American roommate. And he looked out the window and he saw these gentlemen with turbans. And he said to the US American, he said, look, ISIS is outside. And he said it in a panic-stricken voice because that was his immediate experience. Who were these people? Anybody want to, and they were giving out flyers. Anybody want to say, what else could this mean? It's perfectly understandable that this student from Barcelona thought this was, that these people with turbans were ISIS. Anybody have a thought on what else that could mean, people with turbans? Who are they? Everyone. Sick, right. They were probably sick, exactly. So he had never had any contact with Sikhs. By the way, people in their own language, Sikhs refer to themselves in their own traditional language in Punjabi as Sikh, not Sikh. And when they first came to the United States, they realized that they couldn't introduce themselves as Sikh, right? Because people would think they were contagious. So that's why they call themselves Sikhs. But the American roommate who'd been on campus for a while and had been living at the International House, he went down below to see what these gentlemen were doing. What were these flyers about? They were Sikhs. And they were giving out flyers encouraging people to give food to the homeless. So he was a perfect example of what globalization often does, thrusts one person, one idea into another context so rapidly and without context and without history that it causes these kinds of misunderstandings. Fortunately, this gentleman from Barcelona now has learned something about this and can say to himself and to his friends, wait, what else could this mean? This may mean something else. Okay, so let's move on to, yeah, we're going to, let's see, given time, yeah. All right, so here's a drawing done of a gentleman, an original drawing that was given to me as a present. And this particular present was given to me by a visiting scholar at Berkeley. And let me just ask you all, and I'm going to start the video for a second, you'll see why. Let me get a few ideas of who do you think this person is, this drawing of this, who is a very famous person. Let's just see a few ideas of who you think this is. Anything coming into the chat room? Or if you don't know who a particular famous person is, oh, Joe Lurie, somebody said, okay. And I'm not famous. Charles Darwin. That's, many people say Charles Darwin. Okay, anybody else? Abraham, okay. Well, one more, Michelangelo. Okay, so you get the point that everybody will see somebody different. And when you ask yourself, why do I see Karl Marx, or why do I see Michelangelo? Why do I see Charles Darwin? Frequently, when you ask people, why do you think you see that? Frequently, the people who see Charles Darwin have done a lot of studies in evolution, right? People who see Karl Marx may have done a lot of studies in political science, may have studied these kinds of things in their past. And many people, I would say at least 20% say, it's you, Joe Lurie. It's not me. So here's the story about this. Even though I may look a little bit like, you see that? I look a little bit like that. But people would say this because they had no anchor for anyone else. But it's not me. It's not Charles Darwin. It's not Michelangelo. Well, the gentleman who gave this to me was from India. Now, does that give anybody a clue? This hand drawing that he made of this person, he was from India. Who do you think it might be now that he, Gandhi? No. I don't think Gandhi had that kind of hair, but it's okay. Who was the most famous writer, the first Indian to win the Nobel Prize in Literature? Anybody know? Tagore. Voila, Julia. Right on. Okay. So again, you know, something like this, you begin to see what is it causes the perception that I have. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, this is an obvious one. Well, at least it's obvious to those of us who live in California and have had this experience because we have such a large population of people of Mexican descent. So, you know, to make a long story short, when I ask people what this makes them feel like, many people say, oh, it makes me feel weird and frightening. And, oh, some people will say Halloween. Anybody else see something else? Let's just see. Day of the Dead, right. So the celebration of the ancestors, there you go, the celebration of the ancestors. But if you've had no contact and no conversations with people of Mexican heritage or Mexicans, you would only be driven by the prison of your prison. One person actually talked about this reminded him of his studies in biology because they were studying anatomy. So again, just the point that somebody could make a really nasty comment about this to someone who reveres a skeleton that for him or her represents something precious, the ancestors. I don't know if any of you saw the movie, what was that famous movie that came out a couple of years ago? It was an animated movie. Coco, perfect. If you have never seen Coco, I recommend that you show it, you see it, that you perhaps use it in your own intercultural classes or trainings. Okay, so let's move on to the next image. Next, after this, next one. Unfortunately, I can't show all the images because of time, so we'll move to the next one. There we go. So more and more, I don't know. No, back to the previous one. Sorry, back to the previous image. There you go. So more and more, I'm beginning to see images like this in bathrooms. Okay, and it's come to the attention of a number of people, right? That at airports, for example, at San Francisco International Airports, it was noted a couple of years ago that there were a lot of toilet seats that were broken, an amazing amount. And recently, a year ago in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, there were stories in the local press about toilet seats that were broken. So again, you know, what is causing this? Now, some of you may not be aware of the fact that the vast majority of people in the world do not sit on toilets. They crouch. So if you are used to crouching all your life, and that is part of your history, your personal history, your cultural history, the first time that you are confronted with a toilet, and that's the only, a sit-down toilet, and that's the only option for you, the sense is, well, let me, you know, crouch. And I had a very powerful example of this at International House, which I write about in the book, actually, where a maintenance gentleman came to my office, and more mess is left by sprays if not sitting down. Okay, but again, my point here is that if you're used to crouching and all of a sudden you're asked to do your business in a different way, it can cause misunderstanding. So a maintenance man came to my office. Let's go back to that slide, the toilet slide. Okay, stop there. And he came to me and he said, you know, I saw the damnedest thing this morning, Mr. Lurie. I said, what was it? He said, I went into the bathroom and I noticed that one of the doors to the one of the toilet stalls was closed. And I assumed that it was broken because I looked underneath and I didn't see any feet. But the door was locked. So he got up on the adjacent toilet to look down to see what was going on in the toilet where the door was locked. And there he saw a student, it was really a kind of an embarrassing moment, who was crouching on the toilet with his feet on the toilet seat in the way that you see here. And he said, without realizing how difficult this might have been for that poor student who was embarrassed, sit down. Relax. You're in America. So the whole question, squatting toilets are considered cleaners because the user doesn't have skin contact. Okay. So for somebody who is used to crouching, they would say, why would I want to put my butt on the toilet seat where somebody else has had their butt? That's not clean. Again, I'm not making an argument with what is right or what is wrong. As a matter of fact, many doctors will tell you that it is healthier to squat in terms of bowel movements in general. Now, that's a much longer discussion, but if you're interested in this, look up squatty potty, which has now entered the US market, which enables people to squat in a way that enables them also to use the toilet. Also, many of you have traveled to other countries where there's no toilet paper, but there is a hose, right? So it is hard to teach this lesson. It is hard to adjust to any other cultural difference. Intellectually, maybe that's the first step, but to actually change your habits is very difficult. Yeah, it's difficult to teach, right? But when you're traveling to other countries, maybe sometimes it's something that will enable you to say, well, wait a second, maybe there's another way of doing this. And what was most astonishing to me, and I am, in my 70s now, is that my doctors have been telling me, this is a much better, healthier way to do your business, to crouch. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. I don't want to get too bogged down in this. Okay, so this came out, this was on social media a couple of years ago, I think 2 years ago. Let's ask people what they see. Let's see a couple of suggestions as to what people think they are seeing. Ladies in burqas. Okay, that's one perception. Anyone else? What was the first one, Julia? Do you remember what the first one was?
Women only in bus and conservative type country.
Right, there you go. Empty bus seats. And someone says, I know they are actually just bus seats. Okay, so what's the story here? These are bus seats, but I would say in the presentations that I've given over time, a preponderance, over 50% of the people that I've shown this to, the initial reaction was they're burqas. And these are, women in our country. This is from Norway. And how did this come to be? It was extreme right-winger who basically put this on social media because he was reacting to the fact that there were immigrants coming from other countries who happened to be Muslim and who happened to wear burqas. So what he was trying to do was frighten people in Norway. Fear-mongering, there you go. And so basically this is another aspect of globalization where you can use social media to distort and to create fear in ways that are let's see, the photo is too fuzzy. If it were clearer, I don't know. That's a good point, but I suspect that he did this right-winger, to create this sense of fear. And actually somebody in San Francisco recently said when she first saw it, oh, these are seats on the bus here, the Muni bus here in San Francisco, because that was the reality that she was shaped by. But again, here's an example of, excuse me, how this issue of people from different religious backgrounds crossing borders rapidly and without understanding can cause these misperceptions. Let me pause there because I wanted to talk a little bit about how this plays out in other ways. For my book, I interviewed a Yazidi woman. And some of you may recall that the Yazidis, a small culture in northern Iraq, I believe it was, there was genocide against them a couple of years ago by ISIS. And the Yazidis have their own religion, their own traditions, and when they came to this country, because they do wear kind of headscarves, it was assumed that they were Muslim, and they're not. So the woman that I interviewed, she was a refugee, and she settled in Nebraska, where actually it was interesting. Why did she settle in Nebraska, this Yazidi woman who had gone through this terrible period and witnessed all of these horrible things? because in the early 90s, there was a small Yazidi community there. And so she went to what would make her feel most comfortable. So basically, the story is the following. She was working in a cultural center trying to help Yazidis acclimate to the United States. And it was cold one night. She left work late, 10 or 11 o'clock at night, tried to get in her car, and the car door was frozen. She couldn't get into it. So she saw a gentleman in a car maybe 90 feet away, and she motioned to him that she couldn't get into the car. And he wouldn't get out of the car. So she took out her keys and waved her keys to this gentleman, showing that, you know, maybe he's afraid of me because I have a scarf on, it's covering my mouth, it's covering my head. At that point, it was all about being so cold. So when he saw the keys, he came out of his car with a metal rod. Her perception was because 2 weeks earlier, there was an immigrant of Mexican ancestry who'd committed a crime, she thought that he was coming to attack her. Again, both of them the prisms of their experience. What was he doing with that rod? He was coming to help open the door of the car. So this was, again, such a powerful example of people trapped in their own narratives. And the case I'm trying to make is intercultural education is more relevant today than at any point because of this convergence. I call it convergence without context. Okay, Cassie sees this as a powerful example. Okay, and I will, you know, when we get to about another 20 minutes, then we'll open this up for more substantive conversation, Q&A. Let me see here where I am. Okay, so let's go back. Next slide. The next slide. Next slide. Okay, the first thing you see is ISIS Oasis, right? Anybody have any ideas where I saw this? Let's see. Anybody can guess where I may have seen this? Egypt, okay. Let's see some others. California. Karen, you're very well traveled. So, I mean, this was quite amazing. This sign, and then you look at it and you see sanctuary, temple services, lovely lodging, venue for events. We were driving, my wife and I were driving by in a little town called Geysersville, California. It's a very small town, and we see this big sign, ISIS Oasis. The first thing we thought of, what the hell is ISIS doing here? Now, what is another interpretation of ISIS besides the ISIS that many of us have been flooded with it in the media? Goddess. Goddess from where, Karen? Well, that's why somebody said Egypt earlier, right? Goddess of nurturing from Egypt. And what is not well known is that there are about 250 companies in the world that use the letters ISIS in each case, which stands for something different. And many of these companies have had to change their names. I write about this in the book where I'm talking about, you know, missteps in marketing across cultures, because people wouldn't use their services because they thought, right, there you go, there you go. People wouldn't use their services because they, oh, this is ISIS sponsored. So let's look at the next slide, because this is what's really caught my eye. The second slide. This particular ISIS spot, which was inspired by the Egyptian goddess of nurturing, weddings, LGBT friendly. Now, because we live in this crazy world of just, you know, getting headlines or texts, we often don't look at the smaller print or the second sentence or the third sentence. This is also a reflection in my mind of globalization, the rapid crossing of cultures and social media, et cetera, et cetera. So when people see ISIS, they don't necessarily immediately look at the rest. And when they do see LGBT friendly, how could that be? Well, now you know what the real source of it is. And to find this in a little small village in Northern California was truly stunning for us. Okay, so let me see here. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so this is the back of a bald head. Now, depending on what your experience has been with people who are bald, let's say in this case, what kind of a person might this be? What's your first gut reaction? Just tell me what you think this person, what kind of a person this is. Let's see. Man, Buddhist. Okay, there's one. Buddhist. What else? What other kind of person could it be? Cancer patient. Yes. Another possibility. Monk, Marine. There you go. Okay, and you can go on and on. So this is the reason why on the cover of my book I have the back of a bald man's head, which says militant, monk, punk, or patient. And Abby says, I really can't assume anything. But if you've had a particular experience with somebody who has bald head, and that will drive your perception. And that's what inspired my putting the back of a bald head on the updated version of Perception and Deception. Let me give you a practical example of this, how this can cause misinterpretation, fear, et cetera, et cetera. Several years ago, I was in Germany, and I was attending an event where someone was giving a talk about the complexities in different populations in Israel, whether they were secular Israelis, gay Israelis, ultra-Orthodox Israelis, Arab Israelis, Druze Israelis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Ethiopian Israelis. And there was just basically a talk about the panoply and the complexity of the society. It was not a political talk. And I was sitting in the back of the room listening to this, and I happened to be sitting next, and by the way, these talks, because the subject was Israel, just as there are security guards now, unfortunately, at synagogues throughout Germany, and there are increasingly security guards at mosques, security guards, unfortunately, at many churches around the world now. I wasn't surprised to see a security guard there, but when I went in to begin to hear the talk, I was sitting next to a woman next to me who just happened to be an Israeli, and she was reading the Kite Runner in Hebrew. All of a sudden, 5 minutes into the talk, a gentleman comes in, bald head, tattoo. And I got anxious because of the narrative of neo-Nazis in Germany. And he sat right next to me. And there I am, you know, just feeling a little sweat on my hands, right? And all of a sudden, he turns to his right and sees this Israeli woman reading the Kite Runner in Hebrew, and he starts speaking Hebrew to her. And so this notion, my fear of this person possibly being a neo-Nazi, a skinhead, was dispelled when I discovered that he was an Israeli ballet dancer. Okay, so that's the story of the bald head in terms of how it can be misinterpreted. All right, so let's see, great story, Abby says. All right, let's move on to the next slide. I think what we're going to do is talk a little bit, no, to the last slide on this one. Last slide, the very last slide in the series. There you go. Okay, so let's pause there. Let's talk a little bit about refugees. When refugees come to Western countries, particularly those who have experienced trauma, some of the greatest challenges they experience are challenges in the world of healthcare. Now, many of them who have experienced torture come needing healing of the mind. In the United States and in much of Western Europe, it's assumed that if you are troubled in your mind, the best way to get rid of that sense of trouble is talk therapy. Talk therapy. Talk it out. Now, I was born and raised in New York City. If you weren't seeing a psychiatrist in New York City, there was something wrong with you. So it became part of the culture. If you're troubled, go and talk to a psychiatrist, often in the beginning a stranger. Now, for refugees coming from countries where they've been traumatized and then being asked to tell their troubles, their personal, deeply traumatic troubles to a stranger is unthinkable. In fact, if you remember some years ago, after the tsunami in South Asia, Europeans sent Western psychologists, psychiatrists with the thought that they were going to help to heal people, and it did not work because people were reluctant to share their most intimate thoughts with a psychiatrist. I mean, this is a whole big topic. How do you deal with this? Or, for example, let's see, somebody says, well, we'll come to cupping marks in a second, right? I'm going to come to that. I'm not there yet. So basically, some of the refugees would come to hospital rooms and they would be left there for 10, 15, 20 minutes sitting alone. And they would see for the first time, some of them who came from remote rural areas, stethoscopes, blood pressure cups, and their first interpretation was, these are instruments of torture. Why am I being left alone in a hospital room without anyone here for 10 or 15 minutes? If you think about it, those of you who have been to hospitals in the United States, generally in many of the visitor rooms, there are 1 or 2 chairs, and the visiting hours are defined by several hours. This is absolutely irrational for people who come from more collectivistic cultures, most of them from refugee groups in the Middle East, parts of Asia. The idea that somebody can't come visit you at 12 o'clock at night from your family is unacceptable. It's not part of their reality. And then also the idea that you can't have 17 members of your family come and visit you is also, what do you mean there are only 2 chairs in there? So just reflect on that a little bit and see how this plays out in terms of what are the values of the culture and how that drives behavior. Now, in this particular case, I want to move away and say, well, what about people who come from cultures who have a different approach to healing? So somebody here said they saw cupping, right? Which is, for those of you who know, in parts of Asia in particular, you can heat a glass cup and you attach it to the body, and it sucks up. The idea is it sucks up the toxins from within. Actually, I've tried this myself, and it worked for a strained shoulder I had. But if you've had no exposure to cupping, none, no exposure to these images, what might you think when you first see this? Anybody? What might you think? What might your perception be when you first look at this? Abuse, exactly. Could image disease, all right. Oh, there you go. That could mean that as well. So there have been any number of stories about social workers who have reported abuse, what they thought was abuse of children, to agencies in the community, and children have been taken away from their parents because they misinterpreted these marks as abuse as opposed to a different approach to medical healing. And the stories go on about this in much greater detail. Actually, the last chapter in the book is about, half of it is about refugees' encounters with the healthcare system in the United States. One other point on that, and that is that in some cultures, particularly in Asian cultures, when you are diagnosing a disease, that's true. It is hard to tell people to stop doing something they think is helpful. That's true, but because we're living in this time of convergence of cultures without context, that's why I believe intercultural training is more relevant and important than ever. So in some cultures, for example, disease is characterized as a hot disease or a cold disease, or if you're in pain, it can be a hot condition or a cold condition. So one of the stories I tell is about a woman who's giving birth, a Vietnamese woman who's giving birth, which is considered a cold condition. And so the Western nurse is offering her, so she doesn't get dehydrated, cold water, which the woman will not drink, because in the spirit of balancing the body, what she wants is warm water to balance the cold condition of birth giving. Fortunately, there was a woman of Vietnamese ancestry who understood both cultures and brought the warm water in that enabled her to hydrate herself, because she wouldn't drink cold water or ice water, which is against the thoughts of traditional. Right. And in fact, in the United States is one of the few countries in the world where automatically you are served ice water in a restaurant. The idea, I mean, I'm not saying other countries don't do it, but we're one of the, a big minority in terms of ice water. How it's defined, what it means, all of these hidden things is one of the joys of discovery in the intercultural world. Let's now move to the first slide in this image. It's the first emoji in this set of images, the very first one. There you go. Nope, there you go. There it is. What does it mean? So let's have a few of you chime in as to what you think this means. Oh, thank you. Okay, somebody says it means thank you. Anybody else? Please. Prayer. Anyone else? Greetings. Okay. Each of you should ask, should ask yourself, why did I see that? What is there in my background that causes me to have this perception? So when I looked up this particular emoji and who did it, it was, believe it or not, high five. So again, in a world of globalization where long messages are being reduced, emails are now being reduced to texts, texts are being reduced to emojis, think about the implications across cultures. It's one thing to miscommunicate with an email, miscommunicate verbally, person to person. But then when it's reduced to a text, the chances of misunderstanding are even greater. Or an emoji. I would ask all of you who do training or teaching to put up a whole series of emojis and ask people in the group that you're working with what they think they see. And you, I believe, will be amazed at the differences and the potential for misunderstanding. Let me relate this again to, let's see, fortunately, all the emoji interpretations of that one are respectful. Yes, you know, I thought this was namaste the first time I saw it, right? Because I've had a lot of contact with people from that part of the world. But high five was stunning to me. In this case, the chances for you know, misinterpretation or difficult, tragic, painful misinterpretation may be a little bit less. But let me just get to this whole issue of social media again, and that is, I still come from a world in which I do email, and emails of 2, 3, 4 sentences. What I'm realizing is the younger generation is working with texts or emojis, and if I send them an email, frequently they don't get the whole message. Or, you know, how people don't listen to voicemail, younger generations don't listen to voicemail anymore, it takes too much time. So here's an example. I sent a younger person, actually it was my sister, I have a much younger sister, and I sent her an email in which I said, do such and such dates work for your visit? One sentence. Second sentence, does your husband use the middle initial for flying? Two simple sentences in my mind, the mind that was fostered many, many years ago, the way my mind was shaped. You know what her answer was to, do these dates work, and does your husband use the middle initial? That's the second sentence. And her answer was, great. That's it. She just said great. She had not read the second sentence. Ask yourselves how many times, for those of you who still use email, or if you're communicating with people across generations, how often people are not reading the full message. How often, even with a text, they have to move on to the next message. You know the expression FOMA, fear of missing out, FOMO, right? We're being inundated with so many messages so rapidly that the prospect of misunderstanding, in my mind, is growing dramatically. In fact, I think in intergenerational communication classes should become a norm nowadays. Let's see. I think what we're going to do now is to, because we're approaching 9 o'clock and I want to leave time for an open Q&A, let's move to the cartoon. There's a cartoon here. Second image. See, even here, if you showed these images, I guarantee you, if you show emoji images, I got 6 different interpretations for each of these, what they meant. And what the original intent was quite different from many of the interpretations. Let's move to the next slide. Next slide. I mean, that's what the intent was, but you could see that you might have interpreted differently. But keep going. I want to conclude with one last slide. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. That's keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Oh, go back one slide. Go back one slide. There, stop there. Remember these rotary phones? If you think that there is not a disconnect between people of my generation, there you go, Cassie. That is a rotary phone, and they were used up until the late 80s, early 90s. If you or friends of yours or people in an older generation still has one, take this into a class and ask younger people to see how they can make a phone call with this. You will be amazed. If you think that people in my generation are having difficulty sometimes with smartphones, et cetera, think about what a young person is asked to do to make a phone call with this. You will be amazed. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Next slide. And this is this whole question of, I don't know if you can see the text, the full text there. Can you see the full text? No, you can't see it. Okay. But basically, it's about fake news. What is news nowadays? With the ability to distort images, to distort text, to distort all kinds of things on social media, it makes it even more challenging to get a sense of what is really meant here. Next slide. Okay, stop there. I want to conclude with this slide because for me, this particular cartoon was done by a gentleman from New Zealand. He's very well known in New Zealand. His last name, I think it's Malcolm Evans, and he gave me permission to put this in the last chapter of my book. And I think in a way, this kind of crystallizes this whole sense of how people misinterpret things and attach different values without being aware of other realities. So here you see the woman in the bikini, everything is covered by her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. And the woman who's covered up looks at this woman who's walking around like this, nothing covered but her eyes. What a cruel male-dominated culture. Might have even added how the person is objectifying women. So I wanted to conclude with that because for me, it kind of sums up in a very graphic, powerful way how people can misperceive each other without realizing how they themselves are imprisoned in their own prison. And so let me just kind of conclude before we start the Q&A, Julia, with one of my favorite quotes from Nietzsche, which I end with one of the chapters of my book. And it goes like this. Those who were dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. Those who were dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. And powerful intercultural training and education is about helping people to learn new melodies. Okay, so let me stop there. And Julia, I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to open my my video, and I'm happy to take questions from anybody who would like to either question or comment or critique anything I've said, or to offer other perspectives. And then we can eliminate this slide now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. Very informative. And yeah, at this point, if you'd like to either write it in the chat box, I think Joe's also monitoring that, or if you want to unmute your phone and make any comments or questions, that's fine as well. We do have one question. Let me just pull this up if I can, that came in earlier from Cassie, talking about the notion of privacy with people hidden is, in my understanding, taking control to shut out others from information, assuming that asking people for space would not work, but asking is gentler. I get the point, but maybe the KKK copied some of the old European traditions. I guess it's more of a rhetorical question. So I don't know if Cassie, you wanted a response on that, or if that was just more rhetorical.
Well, I don't know whether the KKK copied that or not, but certainly the meaning of what the KK is doing with those hoods had a completely different significance than what I had pointed out in southern Spain. But the privacy issue, I think, in some ways one could say, well, why do they cover themselves? Why do people cover themselves, whether with hoods or burqas? I mean, you could give any number of interpretations. There could be a privacy issue. In the case of the KKK, they may not have wanted to know who they were. In the case of penance, they may have wanted to be showing for penance, may have been for extremely private, embarrassing reasons. you know, what's the reason for a going to church and going to a confessions area? So yes, privacy is also culturally defined. I mean, um, you know, many of us who were born and raised in the United States, I can remember um, wanting to have a single room at college, right? And I was stunned with a student from, actually, he was from Ethiopia, and he was a graduate student, and he was assigned a single room at International House, as graduate students are. And he said he didn't want a single room. It felt too lonely because he was brought up with his brothers and sisters in the same room. The whole idea of being alone in a room was just antithetical to him. He didn't want the so-called privilege of having a single room in his privacy. And I can go on and on about privacy and how there are different approaches to this, and how some people are offended by what they consider to be intrusions into their world. And others would say, you know, this is more about us as a group as opposed to us as an individual. Okay.
So we have a comment there again from Cassie saying, I think we've assumed that privacy is the way to stay safe, but if too much, then way to insulate from life and healthy interactions. Can be debilitated by privacy, stay ignorant. My tenants from India, same thing, they loved sharing the room.
Yeah, and I'll give you, you know, here's another stunning example. Again, the reason I love this field is that I'm always discovering new things. A US American professor, Caucasian, married a Chinese woman born and raised in China. And as many of you know, there are different conceptions of what privacy may mean, and that many US Americans, when they are welcoming their in-laws from China, they can't believe how long they want to stay, or how often they'll wander into rooms without being asked. And he tells, this professor wrote to me, and he told me that when he went to China, he and his wife had their own room, and that he walked into this room one day, their bedroom in China, and his mother-in-law was in the room in his clothing drawer, his underwear drawer. And he was appalled because A, she didn't knock, she came into the room and she was in his underwear drawer messing around. And she knew he had come into the room, but what did she see? What did he see? He saw her taking out one pair of his underwear and cutting it up with the scissors. Now, what was that grandmother doing? The grandmother noted that their child, her grandson, had a diaper on, which was plastic. And from her point of view, this plastic was rubbing the kid the wrong way. And so she wanted to get some cloth to create a diaper that would be less intrusive, less irritating. So she went and got the father's underwear, cut it up to make her own diaper. But this was a perfect example of a different perception of whose responsibility is what, as it relates also to privacy. I remember working in an international student office many, many years ago, and I would have my door closed, you know, as the director of that particular program when I was doing something, and I would be astounded when a woman from China would just come in without knocking, which was perfectly natural for her, perfectly natural. Okay. Books could be written on privacy.
So
anyone else have a question?
We have another question from Cassie. Sorry to speak so much, don't mean to shut anyone out, but I have a question. I wonder how to convey the different impressions without showing all the wonderful slides. Discussing stuff gets overwhelming in itself.
Well, you know, you don't have to show that many slides. I guess because we were limited to an hour and a half, I wanted to at least make the points as quickly and, you know, inadequately, clearly, but other ways of doing this, you know, having people tell their own stories, having people from other countries say what it was that they found when they first came to your particular country that was surprising that they had never seen in another country. There are many techniques to get these different perceptions out there. You don't have to use images. This is just something that, you know, I fell into, and then I became fascinated with how so many people would see the same image differently. But there are many other ways to get at this. I think one of the things that one must be careful of is asking people to say, you you know, when you first came to my country, what shocked you? And that is almost an invitation to criticize. I would rather phrase it as, gee, when you came here, did you see anything in the behaviors in our society that you would never see in your own country? And you'd be amazed at the kind of answers you get. So it's a neutral question. You try to avoid making judgments.
So let's see, we have a question from Gannon. How might we convince colleagues we work with that intercultural training education is important and valuable?
Well, I think that certainly if they have not had any exposure or minimal exposure to people from other cultures, whether they are from other countries or from other cultures within the United States, you know, inviting them to maybe a panel of people from 7 or 8 different cultural backgrounds that all reflect on certain common behaviors, let's say in the United States, that might be eye-opening. Recently I taught a class on understanding immigrants through film and immigrant filmmakers. And, you know, I think sometimes people will be more likely to just kind of sit and watch a movie and be less likely to get offended by a comment in a setting. I mean, using film, like the movie Farewell that came out recently, and the whole issue of, do you tell somebody who is close to death that they're close to death or not? That's a great movie, just to have a beginning discussion about that. Death is a very powerful subject matter, and it's amazing how different cultures approach it. But that movie could set off a very interesting discussion about it. So movies, role plays, reverse role plays, these are some of the ways that you can get these things out on the table without, you know, just being locked into images. And I don't mean to say that images is the only way. I try to do other things, but I have found that when people look at an image and discover that someone's seeing something completely different, it really is kind of a mind opener. Gee, why did they see this? What is it that caused them not to see my reality? Does that count? Oh.
Okay, so we have another question here from Vietnam. I'm not sure if that's pronounced correctly, so please excuse it if it's not. I'd love to know how you debunk the misconceptions of wearing disposable surgical masks during this tumultuous time. I meant growing up in Taiwan, I think it's common, but I learned that a lot of Westerners considering putting on masks weird and even unacceptable.
Right, and this is actually the times in which we're living has kind of generated these kinds of discussions. The question is, are these discussions and different perspectives about the meaning of the mask and the fact that, for example, in Japan, it's so common, on other parts of Asia, not to protect yourself, but to protect others. This is a difficult topic because given the times in which we're living now, and which is also being, you know, exploded with all of the media reports, there is fear. Now, you can't just tell people not to be afraid, but you can have conversations with people to say, well, this could mean something else. So let me give you a concrete example of this that just happened to me 2 days ago. My dentist is a US American, but of Chinese heritage. Her mother was born and raised in China, and she's been in this country for many years, but she's basically been spending most of her time in the Chinese community here in the Bay Area. Not going out too much. She doesn't speak English that well, so most of her friends are from the Chinese community. Several years ago, she had a lung operation, and it had scars that left scars. And this, for many years, she's been coughing, very deep, dry coughs regularly. So her friends know why she's coughing. But today, when she goes out of the home, beyond her circle of friends, to other parts of Chinatown, sometimes beyond Chinatown, people are yelling at her, go back home, saying nasty things to her. So on the one hand, you can what is she supposed to do? Have a rational conversation with people who are completely, flooded with fear? What is needed, I believe, is more and more education about what a cough could mean. Does it mean that you have to, swear at somebody, yell at somebody because they happen to be coughing or wearing a mask. These are the kind of conversations. This is why I'm saying this is a perfect example of globalization. Why is this spreading so quickly? Because there's much more travel across borders. We're in greater contact with each other. So there's no easy answer to this except that we must have conversation about the other potential meanings of this and how to deal with addressing somebody who causes you fear in a way that doesn't polarize the situation.
So we have another question. We have several comments too, but if you don't mind, I'll just kind of go with the questions and people can read the comments on the chat box. Cassie says, America's been so isolated from different cultures geographically, conceptually, et cetera. So valuable to learn to use curiosity. Abby has also said that's common to wear the masks in Korea and Japan, especially in the winter. I also will just kind of comment that I've frequently heard that people will wear them not to protect themselves, but when they have a cold to protect others. So it's also interesting to see the different interpretations on that. Karen has said with faculty frame in terms of how they can provide training for students. Are there any other questions that anybody has?
Well, let me just address Camilla, who said she's asking if I could talk with her or anyone else a little bit more about Kenyan culture. Now, it's been a while since I've been in Kenya, even though I still am in touch with some of my former students there from many years ago. This is what I would do. If you're interested, the first chapter of my book is all about my encounters, my misunderstandings with the encounters I had in Kenya. And you know, Kenya has many cultures. There's over 50 languages, and there are distinctions between those cultures within Kenya. What I would do would be, at the very least, if you're interested, go to my website, and on my website, under my background, the tab that says my background, you can see how to contact me, my LinkedIn site, my email, or if you want, if you're really interested, to at least read that first chapter, which in many ways references many things that are common, not only in Kenya, but in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So that would be my suggestion to Camilla. There is a way to contact me, but go to my website, perceptionanddeception.com.
Any other questions from anyone, either in the chat box or feel free to unmute your phone? Okay, I'm not seeing anything else come up. So thank you so much, Joe. I think that this was a fascinating talk. Again, I think a lot of us talk about perception in our work and really enjoyed the stories that you were able to share and different kind of lenses in which to look through some of this and to remind us. Just a reminder to all of you, we do have these webinar series every month. Our next one is going to be taking place on April 14th with Mai Nguyen, who is a professor in the Netherlands and a neuroscience. We'll be talking about neuroscience. And for anybody who attended the Atlanta conference, she had standing room only presentations there. So really fascinating discussions, and I highly recommend attending that. If you're new to SIETAR and you'd like further information, please visit our website, which is SIETAR, SIETAR USA.org. And there's information if you're interested in becoming a member as well. And also just a plug for our upcoming conference, SIETAR USA conference, which is Mind, Culture, and Society. The theme will take place October 7th through 11th in Omaha. The board of directors met in Omaha last week, and I think all of us were extremely impressed by the city and the diversity within the city. So if you have any further questions, I know the call for proposals will also be coming out soon. So please feel free to check the SIETARUSA.org website for that. And thank you once again, Joe. This was fascinating, and look very much forward to seeing many of you again.
Well, thank you all. I was honored to be invited by SIETAR to participate, and
I wish you all more discoveries and share them as widely as possible. We need them more than ever.
Great.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye, everyone.